Wendy Zukerman is used to tackling big, messy questions. That's pretty much the point of her hit podcast, Science Versus. She and her team take on fads and trends and try to figure out the actual facts. But she recently took on what might be her most taboo subject to date, something that's gotten so little attention from scientists that she had to go collect data on it herself: anal sex. For Scientific American's Science Quickly, I'm Rachel Feltman. Today I'm talking to Wendy about how her quest to break down the myths surrounding the so-called male G-spot led her to help coordinate a massive news survey on basically everything fun you can do with a butt. So, what inspired you to create this survey, and how did you go about designing it?
I've been on a journey, Rachel, an anal sex journey, something I didn't think I would say this year, I'm going to be honest. So the show that I make, Science Versus, the whole point of it is that we take these ideas that are in the zeitgeist, that are online, and then we fact check the hell out of them. And from the serious to the perhaps seemingly trivial. This idea came up about the male G-spot, which has been around for ages. And if you go online, basically every website out there, from British GQ to Healthline, all these seemingly medical-based websites, everyone's the male G-spot, this is, if you press it, you'll get the most amazing orgasms of your life. And for the uninitiated, the male G-spot is the prostate. Everyone's the male G-spot is the prostate. If you have one, press it, amazing orgasms. And I was really? Is that true? Is that true? And am I missing out as someone who doesn't have a prostate? Was my B story.
Yeah, the big important questions.
Well, exactly. Research is me-search. And so I thought one way to answer that question is fairly simple, is you could get a bunch of people who have prostates and a bunch of people who do not have prostates and basically ask them, when you have anal sex or penetrate yourself anally, which is, for the uninitiated, that is how you would reach your prostate. You would put a finger or a penis or a toy about 1 or 2 inches up your bottom, and that's how you would press it. And so the sort of scientific question is that, if you do this, put a finger or a toy or a penis up your bottom for sexual pleasure, is it so much better if you have a prostate? Is that experience so much greater? And I went into the scientific literature thinking that there would be something. Rachel, we've been science journalists for a long time. There's scientific literature on basically on everything.
It's true. So many things that do not seem important, and it's good for you. I'm glad you looked into that.
I appreciate you. Exactly. Yes. But there was nothing had interrogated this question in this way.
Wow.
And even what I realized is this whole topic of anal sex, receptive anal intercourse in particular, also called bottoming, but this idea of putting something into your bottom, that hadn't really been researched that well either. And then what it really made me realize is that this topic that I started as something fun and kind of frivolous, it actually became about something more, which is what kinds of sex are okay and what kinds of sex is science allowed to study and are doctors allowed to talk about. And anal sex has sort of been shifted off to the side as something taboo. And so then that really drove me to do this survey and find out A, how many people are doing this? And then sort of the question of does the male G-spot, and how many people are enjoying it? And let's shed some light in the dark. And then the idea of oh, and by the way, does the male G-spot exist? It sort of became this almost second line story in the end.
Wow. Even having written a whole book about sex and knowing there are so many things that we should have looked into that we haven't looked into yet, it's still shocking to me that really, everyone was just taking this for granted. But I know that you found a couple of researchers who were ready to go deeper. Could you tell me a little bit about folks you worked with in figuring out this survey?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was sort of realizing this whole point that so much of scientific research is really focused on penis-vagina sex. I'm sure there's a more scientific term for that, but that's what we'll use.
I'm pretty sure they do just say PIV, so
right, there we
so
go.
No.
No, excellent. Call a spade a spade. That's what we like to do. It was really interesting because two researchers from across the country in the US, one in New York and one in LA, had actually started looking at this question of receptive anal intercourse just, within the last several years. And they both came upon it from the same perspective. So both of them had been working with prostate cancer patients, and with prostate cancer, the treatment can often affect erections. And so they would be talking to their patients and asking a lot about erections. And both of them, in fact, told me this quote. They were like, so we were asking erections. So that, if you have them both side by side, that is 6 erections. And then for Dr. Dan Dickstein, who's at Mount Sinai Hospital, one of his patients asked him, well, what about receptive anal intercourse? For this patient, it wasn't that important whether he had an erection or not. He enjoyed being the receptive partner. He was more worried like how prostate cancer treatment affect bottoming effectively. And Dan Dickstein was like, I don't know. And then that's when he sort of had the realization that I had, which is that we're not asking because we don't care about, as the scientific community, as, the medical community in the past, we don't care about receptive anal intercourse. It's only, what is the erect penis doing? So much focus on the erect penis rather than the receptive partner. That's sort of what got him on this search. And then Thomas Gaither, who's at UCLA, was sort of having that realization as well. He's a surgeon and he was seeing all these surgeries where the prostate would be removed, and he had heard about the male G-spot as well, obviously, and he would see these patients who were getting their prostates removed and he would wonder, like, is that going to affect bottoming? I mean, I don't know if this patient is interested in bottoming, but how is this affecting it? And so that sent him on this scientific journey as well. And they didn't know about what each other was doing at the time. And so they both published papers really in the last 5 years and have kind of cracked open this research space. So now we're really starting to see something. And, Thomas Gaither has now started this, what he calls the anorectal sexual function index, which is where he is starting to ask patients about receptive anal intercourse, how much pleasure they get, how much pain, and he's then planning on using that to then talk to patients to try to understand whether prostate cancer treatment does affect bottoming. So we should have answers to this question so that when Dan Dickstein gets asked again, he'll be able to tell the patient.
That's awesome. And how did people react to the survey?
So even though, as I mentioned, we're starting to see some research in this space, no one that I had found had done a survey that was speaking to people with both vaginas and penises, so with prostates and without. So even though I could sort of start seeing some stuff in the literature, I didn't have the answer to my question, does the male G-spot exist? And so I made this little video, put it out on social media. We obviously did the survey and spoke to academics to help write the survey, including Tom and Dan and Professor Carolyn Pacol, who is a sexual health researcher in Canada. So we wrote the survey, then we put it out on social media, and it just sort of blew up in this way that I had not expected at all. We have done other sex surveys on the show, and you're looking at the one member of the team that wrote the first scientific study on blue balls. So I think I have done this important work before, but the response to this survey was really out of this world. So we ended up having nearly 16,000 responses that when I was telling the academics, as I was, I kept refreshing and seeing these survey numbers going up and up and up, and the researchers were just like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing, like this is so much data, we're so excited. And so just to put some stats around it, so and I will say, most of the people who filled out the survey were in their 20s and 30s, but more than 800 responses were people over 50, which was really great to see, which is sort of funny because an older person in my life came up to me and was like, well, I'll be your only person who ticked the over 60 box. And I was like, no. That's like, I don't know which one's you. It's anonymous. And what we found is that this topic, that perhaps one of the last big sex taboos, anal sex and anal masturbation, it's just was so common. So, Rachel, so when we're talking about anal masturbation, so this is when you're putting a finger or a toy up your own bottom. Nearly half the people in our survey had said that they had done it in their lifetime. Among that group, we had just over a third had done it within the past month. For anyone listening who is like, this is a gay thing, that was absolutely not what we found in our survey. In fact, over 50% of straight cis men had said that, yes, I have had anal masturbation. So this is really common, and it was over a third of cisgendered women. So people are doing butt stuff, partnered.
Alone, together, yeah.
Partnered anal penetration was similarly quite common. 45% had said, yes, they had anal penetration with their partner, which that 45%, by the way, it's not just a penis. So it could have been like a finger with a partner or a toy with a partner.
Well, other than the general enthusiasm and response, what were some of the surprising things that you found?
To me, and this will show my ageism, which I am sorry for, but among the older people in our survey, there was also a lot of anal play. I had kind of assumed that this was like a Gen Z young millennial thing. But in fact, nearly a third of our sample, over 50, had engaged in anal masturbation within the past 30 days. And that was pretty similar to those who in the younger age groups. So it really feels like a lot of people are exploring this. So that was really interesting to me, and just how common it was. What was also incredibly delightful for me is we had a section in the survey that was sort of like, if you want to tell us more about how you feel about anal masturbation or your orgasms, please do. When I was looking at this response, because it's social media was where we got most of our responses, and it's a convenient sample, it's not necessarily representative. I was like, is this real? Like, are people being honest? But then I would read the comments that people wrote to us, and they were so genuine about wanting to inform science about their experiences with anal. People would say, I don't know if I filled out the survey properly, but like, I really only orgasm if I, touching my clitoris as well as, having anal penetration, or like, I just really want, it's been so important to my life, or like, oh yeah, I've tried it and I don't really like it. And like, just these like varying responses to the same sexual activity. I found that so fascinating, because it's all just like, when you think of the anatomy, like it's all just like nerves and blood vessels, but that people were having this huge range of responses and wanting to tell us about it and wanting to tell science about it was so delightful.
Yeah. Well, and I definitely encourage listeners who haven't to go check out the Science Versus episode where we're talking about, but to give a little bit of context for folks who haven't heard it yet, what did you find about the G-spot and all those nerves, all those bundles of nerves?
Yeah, I mean, it was, so the sort of driving question going into this was to find out, like, so do people with prostates, are they orgasming more from butt play and butt stuff? And they were. They did tend to orgasm more frequently, and they also enjoyed their orgasms more. So we also asked questions like, are your orgasms through anal, receptive anal intercourse better than your orgasms through other kinds of sex? Because through that question, we were really trying to like get to this myth bust around, is it really the best orgasm of your life? I mean, really, I was scanning through some news articles that have been written recently, and it's just like, the amazingness of apparently these orgasms out of control. And so what we did find is that, yes, in general, people with prostates were enjoying their orgasms more and were orgasming more frequently. But where things got complicated in the day, suggesting that perhaps the prostate does play a role in sexual pleasure, nothing in our data suggested that it is some sex button for everyone. And in fact, not everyone was orgasming from anal sex and anal play, even if you just want to look at anal masturbation figures, because, partnered sex can be complicated and it involves different factors, and if you're not comfortable with your partner. But if you just want to look at the masturbation figures, I think they're quite useful, because then you sort of know your body. And again, you would expect if you masturbated and press that magic sex button, bam. But we didn't see like a bam in our data. And what we also saw that was really interesting, so from Thomas Gaither's research, he had seen that people who have more experience with anal sex tend to enjoy it more. And which makes sense, and it's true for other kinds of sex as well. You know your own body, you know what you like. And so because I had spoken to him, I was like, oh, we need to ask about experience as well in the survey. How many times have you done this? And that ended up being really informative, because once we controlled for the experience people had, and so we just took people who had quite a lot of experience with anal sex and anal masturbation, then we saw the differences between people with prostates and those without them got smaller and smaller and smaller. And so from that, and then from the anatomy, to go back to your question, when you look at the like nerves and blood vessels around people who have prostates and those without them, It's all very, very similar. I mean, we're all cut from the same cloth. We've all got like this pudendal nerve that kind of branches into the butt region and stimulates all these good feelings that people can have. And that obviously explains why both people with and without prostates can enjoy anal sex. And so to go back to this question of like, does the male G-spot exist? What we ultimately concluded is that, I mean, I think I'm probably giving the game away. There's no magic sex button per se. There's many sort of different points along the butt that can be arousing. And perhaps for some people, the prostate is quite special and is a nice thing. And we definitely saw that in the data for some people, but it's not a magic sex button. So I think myth busted is really where we landed.
So what kind of stuff are researchers hoping they can do with the data you collected?
So we're really excited because now we're working with this group of academics, including Dan Dickstein, to write it up into a scientific paper and to put the data out there. And it's really wonderful. We had a meeting with them recently with Dan and Carolyn Pokal and Sam Levang, who helped us analyze the data to begin with. And everyone's just really excited to get this information out there to break these taboos around anal sex. I mean, once you see the figures of how common it is, at least in our sample, and how people are enjoying it for the most part, it's just hard to feel this like, we shouldn't be talking about this when almost 50% of our sample had tried it. I mean, I should be honest with you, when starting to research this, I was quite nervous about putting it on my work calendar, male G-spot, anal sex. Quite nervous about that. You know, we had a couple of clips that we put on Instagram. I was like, oh no, am I going to be like the anal sex lady? And now it's like, that's okay. That's great. It's, it's just, I think without good scientific data and surveys like this one, I mean, where are people going to get their information about anal sex? It's going to be pornography or their friends. And getting your information about anal sex from pornography is probably the worst place to get it. Because as we talk about in the episode, preparation, if you are planning on putting something fairly large into your butthole, such as a penis, it can be quite painful if you're not going about it the right way. And if you're not relaxed and you're not using a lot of lubrication and you're not going slow, for example. And in pornography, what you see is really just a dick jamming into a butthole. And I know there is literature out there on, often women's experiences of anal sex where that is what their partner has done. And it is just the worst place. So breaking taboos around receptive anal intercourse isn't just fun.
Right.
It's also really important that we just start talking to people about how to do this properly so that we can have a good time with it rather than it being a painful experience.
And in talking about, the importance of preparation and getting good information, what kind of responses did you get about negative experiences?
So we also asked about coercion, which is, had people ever felt pressure to have receptive anal intercourse when they weren't comfortable with it? And this was also fairly common. So more than 1 in 5 in our sample said yes. And it was particularly common amongst certain groups. So more than 40% of gay cis men said yes. More than a third of people who were assigned female at birth said yes. And so that is also something that's worth discussing, why this is happening, why people are feeling this coercion. And then away from that, we also heard from people who just weren't that into it.
Sure.
And I think that's really important to say because there's preferences around all kinds of sexual activities. And when we asked people for how do you feel, and some people said, it's mind-blowing sex, it's blah, 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 blah. We also had people who just wrote, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's fine. A lot of people, when we asked, is this better than other kinds of orgasms you've had, or is it the same as other kinds of orgasms? A lot of people were just like, it's just the same. It's fine.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important to say. While some people really enjoy it, others don't. So I think it's just a question of like, is this something you want to explore? And here's some really good information about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what kind of responses have you gotten to the episode? I'm especially curious compared to some of your other sex-focused science verses, like the Blue Balls episode.
It's really funny, Rachel. Our sex episodes do quite well. So we can see in the numbers that people are listening, but it is quite silent. So people do not like to tell us that they're listening. I have to say, the male G-spot episode has probably been a little bit louder than our other episodes. But I remember we did one about the orgasm gap, which is why generally you see women orgasming less than men. And I remember hearing nothing on social media and just being like, oh my gosh, like, is no one listening to this episode? And I was like, oh no, people are listening. They're just not telling us about it. There was someone on TikTok that I thought was very sweet, and he was just like, only an Australian could talk this openly about anal sex. But you know what, Rachel? We can change that, you know?
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic goal. That's all for this week on Science Quickly, but don't worry, I'll be back on Monday. We won't have a news roundup next week, but that's because we've got another very special guest lined up for you, filmmaker James Cameron. You get it? You see what I did there with the I'll be back? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, when he's not busy writing, directing, and producing some of the highest grossing films ever, Titanic, Avatar, The Terminator, super casual stuff, James spends a lot of time thinking about, talking about, and exploring the ocean. He brought those passions together to executive produce and narrate National Geographic's new series Ocean Explorers, which premieres August 18th on Hulu and Disney+. Tune in to Science Quickly on Monday to hear more about how James Cameron fell in love with the deep, and to get a taste of the production challenges you face when you try to track down ancient sharks, swim with baby whales, tag ferocious orcas, and so much more, all while trying to make a stunning television show too. So yeah, lots to look forward to in this feed. In the meantime, do us a favor and leave us a quick rating and review wherever you listen to this podcast. You can also send us any questions or comments you have at sciencequickly@sciam.com. Science Quickly is produced by me, Rachel Feltman, along with Fonda Mwangi, Kelso Harper, Madison Goldberg, and Jeff DelViscio. Shayna Posses and Aaron Shattuck fact-check our show. Our theme music was composed by Dominic Smith. Subscribe to Scientific American for more up-to-date and in-depth science news. For Scientific American, this is Rachel Feltman. Have a great weekend.